So this is exam 2. We're reviewing chapters 4 through 6 and chapter 9. So 4, 5, 6, and 9. Chapter 4, of course, is market failure. Chapter 5 is government failure. Chapter 6, elasticities. And 9, we launch into our cost curves, if you will. At any rate, we'll just going right in again. To start with is chapter 4, of course, with market failure. So when we talk about chapters 4 and 5, market failure and government failure, they're intertwined, so I kind of go back and forth. Very, very short on the government failure side, but we mix a lot of that in when we talk about market failure. So market failure comes in 3 forms, if you will. One is market power itself, or price power. Second would be externalities, and third would be dealing with the problem associated with rivality, or goods that are rivalrous or non-rivalrous, if you will, or non-rivality in terms of consumption. And we'll get into that. That's public goods domain, etc. So starting with market power itself, we're looking at monopolies, oligopolies, natural monopolies. So monopolies, of course, are that's the firm is a market, the market is a firm. Oligopoly would be a few firms, a handful of firms, and natural monopoly would be monopolies that are sanctioned, if you will, that are allowed by government, because monopolies in general are not allowed; they're disallowed. That's why we have antitrust laws in place to prevent monopolies from forming. So if we look at the sweep spectrum, if you will, going from perfect competition, we start with perfect competition, to monopolistic competition, to oligopoly, and finally to monopoly. So we're taking that broad sweep across. We're starting, in this case, with the problems that are associated with monopolies, oligopolies, and natural monopolies, etc. So monopolies, again, are the firm. The firm is a market, the market is a firm. And the same with oligopolies, a handful of firms. They both have very high barriers to entry, of course. And the reason they have high barriers to entry, the easiest one to think about it is in terms of cost. If you were to start an auto company, for example, in terms of oligopoly, it would cost you several billions of dollars, and just upfront cost, fixed cost, plus there would be a long time frame, there would be a long time before you can actually produce vehicle one, if you will. And it's also the flip side of that, of course, is that it's there are entry-level barriers and barriers to entry, and there are also barriers to exit. Barriers to exit would come in the form of cost associated with pensions and various legal things that occur that go on well beyond when, if your company, for example, actually stopped existing. There are still legal issues that kind of fester, if you will. But anyway, monopolies, oligopolies again are a few firms. Natural monopolies are utilities. So utilities are natural monopolies, and natural monopolies are utilities. Utilities meaning the production of electricity, production of natural gas, so on and so forth. Those are natural monopolies, and government sanctions them. They provide them the charter, if you will, to actually exist and to operate within the given state. So that would be like Detroit Edison, for example, on the east side of the state, or on the west side of the state would be Indiana, Michigan and Power for electricity, and like Semco for gas production or natural gas delivery, etc. Anyway, you get the idea. Those are natural monopolies, and the reason that they exist is because for efficiency purposes, meaning, and this is just an example, we'll talk more about this as we go forward, but natural monopoly, the reason natural monopolies are in place is because, or at least one of the reasons, if you had electricity, if you had several electrical companies, electricity producing companies, utilities, they would have to deliver that power to your home, and it would end up, if you had one block and 5 or 6 different producers of electricity, or people that are firms that are delivering that electricity to your home, the problem, of course, is that you would have spaghetti overhead. It's bad enough as it is with overhead power lines, but if you had 4 or 5 more companies added to the mix, that would make it that much worse. Anyway, that's a natural monopoly, the reason, the rationale, the reason for being. Jumping ahead to FTC and the Department of Justice, those are the folks that it's their duty. The FTC, Federal Trade Commission, Department of Justice, Antitrust Division. Remember, whenever you see antitrust, that means anti-monopoly. So that's the reason that they are in existence is to protect the consumer, of course, the FTC in particular, and also the Department of Justice in terms of protecting competition and ensuring that firms don't gain too much market power, too much price power. They are one and the same. Prevent firms from moving into that monopoly status or even closer to the monopoly status. So they're the ones that are tasked with preserving consumer sovereignty, if you will. Anyway, so regulatory capture, what that does is I think the economist was George Stiglitz from the University of Chicago, and basically what he was saying is that the regulators become captive of the regulatees, which means that, in a quick example, you're a utility company and you want to raise rates, and so in order to raise rates, you have to go to the state commission. In Michigan, it's Michigan Public Services Commission, or maybe PUC, Public Utilities Commission, I forgot. But most states have this. Anytime, like in Michigan, it's for utilities, and it's also for financial. There's the Department of there's a financial aspect of it for insurance and finance. I think it's DIF. Anyway, so they're the ones that are kind of the gatekeepers. They have to rubber stamp any kind of price increases or changes in policy or so on and so forth. So if we're looking at a price increase, you're a utility and you want to raise your prices, and you justify it by saying your costs have gone up in some manner, some way, shape, or form. You present that to the commission. Commission takes it under advisement, and they have an analyst review the material, and the analyst comes back and says, nope, not going to work because your numbers are wrong on page 47B3 or whatever, and go back and correct them, and so on and so forth. So you do this several times over, and you the utility are tired of spending thousands and thousands of man hours or people hours, if you will, and hundreds of thousands of dollars on this, trying to get this price increase through. And so you finally just surrender and say, okay, you tell your people, you're the CEO, you tell your people to go out and hire this person who's causing problems. So though that's the analyst is being paid $70,000, say, or $100,000, doesn't matter, by the by the Services Commission, and so you approach them and say, okay, we would like you to work for us, and we're going to double, triple, quadruple your pay, whatever it takes to get you to come on board. So this happens all the time, not just with the Public Service Commission, as I just described, but also, of course, with Department of Justice Antitrust Division. Their role, again, is to protect the consumer, and the opposition's role is to protect the company, to help the company to merge and to acquire other companies in order to do what? To gain market power, really. Anyway, so that's market power. The next, we're looking at externalities, and externalities, we're asking government to internalize these externalities. We as society deem that these externalities are these are things that are outside of where we want to internalize them. We want to bring those inside the economy, inside the consumer. We want these inside, and so as a result of not just consumer, the households, etc. We want to internalize this. We want to bring this inside. We can't do it ourselves. We ask government to step in to internalize those externalities, external benefit. There's either not enough being produced or it's priced too high. So we ask government to step into, in this case, education is a good example, to produce more education or to subsidize that education. So as a result of which, because of government intervention, we end up with what? More education. And the government failure side, of course, comes into play in terms of, yes, we have more education quantity-wise. How about the quality of education? Anyway, you get the idea. So that's an external benefit or a positive externality. The other side of that would be an external cost or a negative externality, and we say that there's either too much being produced or it's priced too low. So we ask government to step in to rectify, to fix the situation, to intervene. And so the example that we would use, the production of electricity. So government steps in and puts regulations in place to reduce the production of that electricity, and as a result, it also does what? Raises prices. Law of demand says what? That if you raise prices, you're going to reduce the quantity demanded. So in effect, what happens is that we're asking, with the presence of pollution, we as consumers, we like our goods and services priced very low and very plentiful, but we realize that there's a problem in terms of the pollution, and clean air, for example, is a normal good, so we want more of that, correct? So anyway, we ask government to step in, and what government does is puts regulations into place saying that you have to reduce the amount of pollution by X parts per million, for example. And if you don't produce by X parts per million, you, the producer, then you're going to be fined X number of dollars, per incident, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so that's the externality or external cost. So how these externalities actually play out is that, represented, when we're looking at these things graphically, when we're talking about demand side failure, we're asking government to address that demand side failure, to fix that demand side failure in the form of this external benefit or positive externality. We're saying that there's not enough of something being produced, so government steps in, and the result is that they're shifting demand, in this case to the right. Remember, movement to the right, whether we're talking about a demand curve or a supply curve, shifting that demand curve or supply curve to the right is an increase. So we're asking government to step in to increase the production, increase the amount of goods and services that are actually being produced. So we're addressing demand side failure. We're fixing demand side failure, shifting from demand 2 in this case to demand 1. The other side of this equation has to do with the supply side failure, and that's an external cost. And so while we're the opposite, of course, of this demand side failure, as government steps in to do what? To reduce the amount that's actually being produced and or to increase the price. And so the way we can increase prices, of course, is to do what? Shift supply. So in this case, we're shifting the supply to the left. Remember, leftward movement, shifting the supply or the demand curve means a reduction in the supply or the demand. Rightward shift means an increase in the supply or the demand. All right, so in this case, we're again shifting our supply to the left, moving from S1 to S2 in this case, and as a result of which we end up reducing the supply. So we're asking government to step in to do what? To cause supply side failure. So it's just kind of interesting is that we're actually asking government to step in to make this failure happen. And again, the rationale behind it, of course, is to we don't have the demand curve here, but increase prices and or reduce the quantity demanded, and that's what we do. We ask government to step in to cause this supply side failure, shifting supply to the left in order to reduce the amount of pollutants, reduce the amount of pollution that was caused by this firm producing electricity. Okay, so onward we go in terms of market failure. We're looking in this case now at the last piece of this, or non-rival goods, or the concepts of rivality or rivalrous, goods that are rivalrous, goods that are rival in consumption. So I'll step ahead. Hopefully this will make it a little bit clearer. We're going to skip public goods for a moment, and we're going to speak to private goods. Private goods, we say, are rival in consumption, and they are excludable. So what that rival or that rivality in consumption means is that the individual can consume this, and when we're talking about consuming, it's going to by consuming, it's going to reduce the amount that's out there, and you can also exclude other people from using whatever it is that we're talking about. So in this case, it could be a sandwich. It could be so rival in consumption, meaning you've got a sandwich, and by eating half of the sandwich, that means that half of the sandwich is gone. So you are consuming it; it's going away. Your actions are causing it to be reduced, the sandwich, the amount that's there. And you can also exclude other people from consuming that sandwich. Or another example, more typical that I've used in class, is an automobile. You have an automobile with 0 miles on it, it's brand new, just off the lot, you drive it off the lot. You are the one that controls that vehicle, meaning you, by adding more miles to it, you're consuming that vehicle, you're using it up. So if it lasts 200,000 miles, we'll say, you can, by driving it from the first few miles out of the lot through the 200,000 miles, you consume that vehicle. And furthermore, you can exclude other people from accessing or using that vehicle. Straightforward. Those are private goods. The flip side of that are public goods. They are non-rival in consumption, where private goods are rival in consumption. Public goods are non-rival in consumption. By adding one more consumer, it does not alter the amount available. So an example that we talk about many here, but for example, like military. So the U.S. is a country of about 335 million people, somewhere in there. And by the time, anyway, so 335 million people will say, and the military is whatever, 5 million in toto, for the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, throw everybody else in there too, I guess, Coast Guard. Anyway, you get the idea. By adding another person to the mix, it's not going to reduce the amount of military that's out there. It's not going to go down. So by adding one more consumer, it does not alter the amount available. It's straightforward as that. It's non-excludable, meaning that it's very hard to exclude somebody from the benefits that are associated with having a military, right? Whether you like the military or not is irrelevant. The point is that the military being there is going to it's very hard to exclude people from from benefiting from that. If you're in Kansas, you're still benefiting from the Navy, for example, because it keeps open the sea lanes, and so that the goods and services that you want are goods that are coming from overseas are in protected sea lanes, are not being overrun by pirates, etc. Anyways, you get the idea. So those are public goods. Next are quasi-public goods, non-rival in consumption. So by adding one more consumer to the mix is not going to reduce the amount of whatever is out there, and yet it's also excludable. Example of that would be the post office. Anybody can use the post office, but to actually, can enter the post office, but to actually utilize their services, you have to do what? You have to purchase postage. That's the excludability side. Turnpike, very similar, state parks versus municipal parks, and this is I'll get to that in a moment, but a turnpike, of course, anybody has access to the turnpike, but in order to leave the turnpike, you have to actually pay. Common goods, rival in consumption, so adding one more consumer reduces the amount available, and it's non-excludable. Don't have that on the list here, but it's non-excludable, meaning our example would be the Grand Banks fishery. By going off the coast of Canada, it's in international waters, so you cannot exclude anybody from use of it because it's international. No one owns it, and everyone owns it at the same time. And of course, the problem with this is that the rival and consumption piece comes in. Is if you take out 1 million fish, it's going to reduce the population of fish, or one fish for that matter. So this is where that rivalry comes into play. It's also termed the tragedy of the commons, and our example between the quasi-public good and common good comparison. The state park would be a quasi-public good. You have to actually pay to access the park, versus a common good, which would be a municipal park where no one has to pay and anyone can walk through. There tends to be more litter. I'm just saying this as an example. Might be more litter in a state park than there would be in a municipal park, because no one has to pay. No one owns it, if you will. Okay, so onward we go. Moving on to consumer surplus. So this is our representation of consumer surplus. We've got a demand curve sloping downward to the right. So again, anytime you have a downward sloping demand curve, that indicates some sort of price power, and we'll get to that in a moment. So in this case, we have two figures. One is the triangle that's above the price line. It's bounded by the price line, the demand curve, and also the price line, the price axis, the y-axis, the vertical axis. So it's the vertical axis, the price line, and also the demand curve. It's a triangle that's formed by that, and that is called the consumer surplus. This is the portion that represents what the consumer would be willing to pay but does not have to pay due to competitive pressures. Again, this is the consumer surplus. The consumer is not paying this, but if prices were higher, they would be paying, a portion of that, if you will. And further, the rectangle that's down below, the square that's down below, represents what the consumer actually paid. And that, if you break it apart, we'll get to that in a moment, represents the producer surplus and also the opportunity cost that's faced by the firm. The takeaway is that that rectangle represents price times quantity. Revenue is equal to price times quantity. So that square, that rectangle, would represent the revenue that's flowing through to the firm. Remember, the firm is a place where production occurs. Keep that in mind. And so it may land there first, but that revenue is going to flow elsewhere. Okay, so onward we go. We were just talking about consumer surplus. Now we're going to add a little complexity to this. So what we're looking at is on the lower left-hand portion, we're looking at what's called the producer surplus. And from our initial representation in the previous representation, we showed that revenue box, that square or that rectangle, that revenue is equal to price times quantity. And so in this one, we're breaking this apart. The portion that producer surplus is off to the left. Off to the right, it's not indicated here, but there's off to the right, there's the other half of that box. The other triangle represents the opportunity cost. And what that means is that's the opportunity cost that so those are what it costs the firm to actually produce those goods and services, whatever these goods and services are. In this case, we're talking about oil. So that represents the opportunity cost, and the opportunity cost, what that means is that the firm, what they're paying for the use of those productive resources, for the labor, entrepreneurship, capital, and land. And that would be, again, the opportunity cost level. Remember, opportunity cost is next best competitive option. So these are the competitive prices, if you will, that the firm is paying for the use of those productive resources. The producer surplus, on the other hand, represents the additional portion that is being paid to the firm for, in this case, we're talking about oil, so this would be above and beyond their opportunity cost level of compensation. Remember, it may land at the firm, but it doesn't stay at the firm. The firm is going to do what? It's going to dispense or disperse or send this producer surplus back to the household as owners of those productive resources for the labor, entrepreneurship, capital, land. Some combination thereof could be all going to the entrepreneur. Who knows? Anyways, this is what's going back, if you will, to the household as owners of those productive resources. So think about it this way: the producer surplus and also the opportunity cost level goes to the household as owners of the productive resources, and the consumer surplus also goes to the household as the consumer. So remember, keep this in mind. The consumer surplus, again, goes back to the consumer. How many of us are consumers? Yes, we are all consumers. So far as household as producers for our productive resources, yes, we all have productive resources, but we're not necessarily we're not all working for the firm that we're talking about in this particular case. So the takeaway from this is that producer surplus is going back to the household above and beyond their opportunity cost level of compensation. So this is in excess. This is excess compensation. And who is harmed by producer surplus? Yes, the consumer, right? So anyway, we're going to, the quickest way to increase revenue, remember, increasing revenue, we've got two choices: price times quantity. Increase price, increase quantity. We don't care which one. We don't really care whether it's increased quantity, increased price. It all depends on our elasticity, assuming that we are in the inelastic range, so we're below that midpoint, below that unitary elastic point. The surest way for us to increase our revenue would be to increase prices. So how does a firm increase prices? So if you have market power, in this case we're looking at oil again, you would be shifting the way you increase prices is not by increasing prices. It's by reducing supply, restricting supply, pulling supply back. And so if you reduce supply going from S1 to S2, you slide up that demand curve, and so you end up what? With a higher price. And assuming, again, that this is a revenue enhancing price increase, then our revenue goes up as well. And as a result of which, in our graphic on the left, we're showing there are 4 areas, or 3 areas rather here. We're looking at the producer surplus increasing, that odd-looking rectangle above the previous price line that's added to the producer surplus. And we have the consumer surplus shrinking again. And we also have what's called the deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is a loss to both the consumer and to the producer. Producer doesn't care because of what? Because the producer ends up with more revenue. Revenue equals price times quantity. They don't care about this loss in quantity. All they care about is increased revenue. So the consumer loses, producer gains as a result. And the deadweight loss is a loss to both sides, but the producer doesn't care. And again, we're looking at this on the right-hand side. We're looking at it in depiction in terms, again, of a little less crowded, if you will, of a market price of oil, rather, the market price of power and oil. One, producer surplus grows, benefiting only some in the household sector with a stake in higher oil prices. So if you work at the firm, you're CEO of the firm, you're owner of the stock of this oil company, ExxonMobil, for example, you benefit. The consumer surplus shrinks, harming consumers. We're all consumers, so we're the ones that we are harmed by what? Higher prices. Deadweight loss grows, and reducing efficiency. Because remember, efficiency, our definition for efficiency is what? Maximum number of goods and services at the lowest possible price, right? So these increasing prices and so on and so forth, that's restricting supply. It can go the other way around. You can actually increase supply, right? This is where we're talking about expanding consumer surplus. And our example of this with oil, again, we'll stick with oil for the time being. It's always a touchy subject. So if you go back to the year, we'll just say 2010, 2008 even. So now we're getting into double-digit years, right? Anyway, so a number of years ago, the U.S. was pretty much captive of what we would call the world price of oil, meaning the world price of oil being dictated by such entities as OPEC, the oil-producing exporting countries, Saudi Arabia in particular. So what happened was that since that time, and this also speaks to this whole idea of elasticity, in that the longer the time frame, the more impact time itself has on that elasticity, the ability to come up with substitutes. And so in this case, long story short, this increase in substitutes would be the increase in the amount of crude oil that's being produced, the countries that are producing the crude oil. The country in particular that I'm talking about, of course, is the U.S. The U.S. increased the quantity of oil through the fracking and not just oil, all energy in terms of natural gas, etc., right? Natural gas and oil, increasing the production of both natural gas and oil to the point where the U.S. is now the largest producer, I believe, of oil, and certainly the largest producer of energy in the world. So as a result of which, by increasing the supply, so we're going the other way now, we're shifting from S2 to S1, we're expanding the supply. And so what that does is it wins back the consumer surplus. So it makes the consumer surplus that much higher, if you will, than it was before, moving back to where it was originally, I guess, from the previous one. But again, the idea is that we're expanding the consumer surplus, reducing the producer surplus, and it also is getting rid of that deadweight loss, right? So we're increasing the efficiency, lowering prices. Efficiency, again, means the maximum number of goods and services at the lowest possible price. So this can move in both directions, and time being the most critical element in this movement. So onward we go. Kind of wrapping things up, if you will. Chapter 4, Chapter 5 kind of commingle when we talk about the government role. First, we're looking at resource allocation. We're addressing that suboptimality. And remember, suboptimality could be too much external cost, or too little in terms of external benefit, trying to, to change that mix. And that suboptimality could occur on both the productive resource side and also, of course, on the consumer side, meaning that you'd have more school teachers than you would, say, have managers, or shifting managers into that school teacher role, if you will. And also, so that would be on the bottom portion. On the top portion, of course, is that we're producing more education, but at the cost of maybe less production so far as consumer goods are concerned. Because we're going back to our production possibility frontier curve, we're talking about the production of capital goods versus consumer goods. And capital goods, included in capital goods, should be, or you could definitely make an argument for, that capital goods are that human capital, right? Producing more students, producing more. And so this is, of course, why do we produce more capital goods? Why do we produce more educated people? So that they can do what? Produce more consumer goods down the road. Anyway, you get the idea. So government's role steps in terms of changing that resource allocation, and also changing the outcomes, if you will. Secondly, stabilization, that's the fiscal policy, that's the tax and spend, the legislative branch, if you will. Whether we're talking about Congress at the federal level, House and Senate, or if we're looking at the state or local level, the various governments, the spending authorities within those jurisdictions. The next, of course, would be the monetary authority, which is the Fed, the Federal Reserve, and they're the ones that are responsible. Again, both of these, fiscal and monetary, are focusing on employment, inflation, economic growth. But on the monetary side, those are the folks that focus primarily. We're talking about interest rates, whether we're talking about excuse me, lower interest rates or higher interest rates, regardless. Again, that's the monetary policy authority. Stabilization, trying to make sure that we have economic growth, sustained economic growth, without too much inflation, right? Lastly, there's another one would be included in this but that has to do more with growth as well, but we'll stick with these three: redistribution of income, income taxes, transfer payments, trying to make the income distribution more equal, right? Has it been successful? That kind of bleeds into Chapter 5. All of these things, you could say that there's a problem. This market failure where government overreaches moves into, again, Chapter 5 when we talk about government failure. Has government tax policies, in fact, made the income distribution more equal? Nope, hasn't worked. Are they always spot on? Are they always correct in terms of their stabilization efforts? No, rarely, actually. Resource allocation, have we increased the amount of education, the quantity? Yes. Is that education, is the quality up to the same level of the quantity? You could argue against that one. That, again, is government failure. Chapter 5. Real quickly, three different topics. Layered government, meaning that you have, example, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level. You also have at the state level. In Michigan, it used to be the Department of Environmental Quality, I think, DEQ, and it's been changed to some other name, EGL. I believe, something with the Great Lakes, environmental Great Lakes, I don't know. Anyway, enforcement or something along, I forget what it is, but so there's something at the federal level, state level, and usually at the state, county level, and also at the local level. You have different layers of these government. The problem with that, twofold: one is that it gets very expensive. Two, they all claim responsibility until something terrible happens, like the Flint water crisis, which has now turned into multiple communities around the states having problems with lead in their water, including like Benton Harbor, for example. So that's layered government, public choice. Basically, it's a very cynical approach, but basically what it says is that politicians their main goal is to be reelected. Nothing to do with helping people or any greater motivation, and it has to do with, it kind of ties into a concept called the principal agent problem, if you will. So this is in the private side and also on the public side. So principal agent, the principal on the private side would be the owners of the company, the shareholders. The agent acting at the behest of those owners of the company would be like the CEO, would be the board of directors, et cetera. And the idea behind that, of course, is that at least in theory, they're supposed to be working together, meaning the entrepreneur is supposed to be working for those shareholders, those stockholders, right? Problem with that, of course, is that that's not always the case. And example, you have an entrepreneur, you've got a CEO of a company, and they have a stock option that they can exercise. They were told that they could. The share price when the person started as CEO was at $10 per share, and they were given a 3-year window in which to increase the share price of the stock. And so it's about 3 months away, and it's gone up to $15 a share. So what that means is that they're eligible to, the CEO of the entrepreneur is able to do what? We'll just say they're able to buy 1 million shares of stock for $10 a share, and they could turn around and sell that shares of stock at that market price, the current market price of $15 a share. So they'll end up making $5 million in the process. Sounds good. But that CEO or that entrepreneur is saying, wait a minute, I want more than that. So they're going to make every effort to drive up that share price even more. Sounds good for the shareholders as well, right? Problem is that they may be doing something it could be something illegal for all I know, but it could also be something that's not going to be beneficial to the company in the long run. Might be selling off some assets or doing something very, very short term in order to drive up the share price from $15 a share, say up to $20 a share or $30 a share. And it's all good and well for whom? For the entrepreneur, for the CEO to exercise the stock option, but it may not be the case for the shareholders kind of going forward, the long view. Anyway, you get the idea. In the public area, of course, we're looking at agent, principal agent problem having to do with whom? The principal being the voter and the agent, of course, being the politician. And politician promises a lot, and then they get into office and they disappear until it's time for election time again. 2 years down the road or 4 years or 6 years down the road. And in the meantime, they're all about doing what? Making sure that they're reelected. So they're out there getting funds from various lobbying groups and so on and so forth. The last thing we're talking about here in Chapter 5 are unfunded liabilities. Unfunded liabilities would be an example of that would be Social Security. Social Security by the year 2033, the trust fund is going to go to zero, meaning that the problem is that it's not to say that there's going to be zero payments coming out, but the payments are going to be reduced by anywhere from, best guesses, 25 to 35% if nothing changes, meaning unless there are taxes that come into place that kind of that increase the trust fund, if you will, that's out there, or making some other changes, making it so that people can't retire until not age 62, but push it up to 65 and push up the official retirement age from 68 up to 70, and so on and so forth. There are different ways it can be dealt with, but this is certainly an example of government failure. On to Chapter 6, price elasticity of demand. In fact, we're talking about all elasticities in Chapter 6 in general, and elasticity has to do with the sensitivity to price level changes is really what we're talking about. The sensitivity to whatever it is that we're talking about. In this case, price elasticity of demand, so we're looking at demand. So the takeaway from this, of course, when we're talking about PED or price elasticity of demand, it's the change in quantity demanded over the change in price, period. Okay, change in quantity demanded over the change in price. Keep that in mind. So very briefly, we've talked about price elasticity of demand quite a bit, so I'll be brief about this here. So on the left-hand side, we've got a demand curve on top, and on the bottom we have a total revenue curve. And assuming we're to the right of that, I've got it listed as equilibrium price. It should actually be a midpoint, but regardless. So we're at that midpoint, and to the right of that, sloping downward to the x-axis, this is what's called the inelastic range. The inelastic range, meaning that price level increases are going to be rather revenue enhancing. They're not going to be negative impact, if you will, on the on the firm's products that they're trying to sell. So if you're in the inelastic range, and we'll just say the current price is at 1 and you're selling 3, quantity 3, you're going to raise prices up to $2, and that's going to reduce, of course, the amount of goods that you're selling from 3 to 2, because law of demand dictates what? Price goes up, quantity demand goes down. You don't care about that. All you care about is increasing your revenue. And as a result of which your revenue goes up from 3 total revenue to what? To 4 total revenue. So you are content with that. You have reached that point, the unitary elastic point or uninelastic point, but you don't know that you're there. Okay, we're just making that assumption. You have no idea where that's at, or you don't know exactly where it's at. Same thing. Point being is that, so your next step is you're going to raise prices because it worked before. Try it again. So you're going to raise prices, in this case, from $2 up to $3. And as a result of which, your law of demand kicks in, of course, you're just going to be reducing the quantity demanded. You're going to reduce your quantity demanded from 2 to 1. And as a result of which, your total revenue dropped from $4 down to $3. So you've gone past that midpoint, gone past that unitary elastic or unit elastic point. So in order to, if you're in the elastic range, again, moving leftward up the demand curve, closer to that y-axis. And so if you want to increase your revenue, that's what we're all about, is that what do? We reduce prices. So you're reducing prices from $3 down to $2, and as a result of which you end up increasing your total revenue from $3 up to $4, getting us to that unitary elastic point. The takeaway is this: you don't know where that unitary elastic point is at, or the unit elastic, that midpoint, however you want to call it. You don't know where it's at, and the only way that you can find that point is by changing prices, jiggering prices, manipulating prices. And on the right-hand side, we're looking at our marginal revenue curve, and that's, remember, marginal means one more unit. By changing things by one more unit, you're trying to find that sweet spot. The only way you know where the unitary elastic point is by passing that unitary elastic point, right? Marginally speaking, you're adding one more unit to the mix. And marginal revenue, again, by the way, is 1/2 of the average revenue, which is the demand curve. So average revenue again is the same as the demand curve. We've been talking about demand curve, but it's also called the average revenue curve, and that will become more important as we kind of go forward. And 1/2 of that demand curve, or that average revenue curve, is our marginal revenue curve. All right, and marginal means, again, one more unit of revenue. In this case, and 1/2 of that, the distance between the demand curve and the y-axis, or if you bisect the x-axis on the bottom, again, bisecting it, meaning between the demand curve on the right and the y-axis on the left, that's representative of where the marginal revenue curve is at. So marginal revenue is 1/2 of the average revenue. So next we're looking at the impact, if you will, of elasticity, what this kind of really means in real practice, in the real world, if you will. So if we're talking about the first image on the top left, we're looking at the two demand curves, D1 and D2, and what happens is that new midpoint, or I should say the midpoint or the unitary elastic point, by shifting the demand curve rightward. So think income effect, right? Having more income, you're going to be able to do what? Buy more things, right? So that shifts our demand curve to the right. We're shifting it from D1 to D2. What this also indicates is that by shifting that demand curve, all else remaining constant, right? Supply remaining constant, you would end up with a higher price as a result. So the income effect, again, shifts to the right. It drives up that unitary elastic point, and unitary or unit elastic point shifts that upward as well. So that's our depiction, if you will, of that income effect, how that plays out so far as price elasticity of demand. So far as the substitution effect is concerned, what we have is that the flattening demand curve results in, if left unchanged, the price level, all else equal, ceteris paribus, price level in the inelastic range in this case. if left unchanged, the price level is in the inelastic range. Actually, it's the opposite. It's actually in the elastic range. But regardless, what we're saying then is that if the price remains the same, the flattening of the demand curve. What the flatter the demand curve? Think about it this way: the flatter the demand curve, the more beneficial that is to whom? To the consumer. The steeper the demand curve, the more beneficial that is to whom? The producer. Think about it as the firm, the first stopping point along the way, and the proceeds going through that income back to the household as owners of those productive resources that are employed by the firm, including, of course, the entrepreneur, etc. But the idea, of course, is that the game that you want that's to be played is that with the flatter the demand curve, that's more beneficial to the household as consumer because that there's more of a difference so far as if there is a price increase. So we're all about increasing our revenue. So if we increase prices, if we have a flatter demand curve, that's going to result in an increase or a decrease or more, I should say, an increased reduction in the quantity demanded. If you have a flatter the demand curve, the more loss in terms of quantity demanded is concerned. The steeper the demand curve, the less loss in quantity demanded, because price increase regardless is going to end up with what? Law of demand, right? It says what? Price goes up, quantity demanded is going to be reduced. Steeper the demand curve, the less of an impact that price increase has upon it, and in more likelihood you're going to be more likely in the inelastic range versus the elastic range. So in this case, what we're saying is that if we raise prices, for example, and we're on the right hand side on the with D2, that we'd be moved into the elastic range. So that would be reducing our revenue, as opposed to on the left hand side with that steeper raising prices up to this P1 gets us to the unitary elastic point. So we would actually be increasing our revenue. It's really what we're looking at. So the different types of elasticity, in this case, we'll start with cross price elasticity. We're trying to determine whether or not goods that we're talking about are substitutes or complements is really what it comes down to. Complement meaning completing something or other. So substitutes, we're determining if they're, again, if this is indeed a market. So the price of good A goes up, the quantity demanded of good B goes up. So our example for this would be the price of, in this case, a Ford F-150 pickup truck increases by $1,500 and ceteris paribus, nothing else changes. We would say that the quantity demanded of Chevrolet Silverado pickup trucks increases. So this is determining whether or not there's actually a market in place, whether or not this constitutes the market. And certainly, two pickup trucks would be part of the same market. So another example of this, maybe a little clearer, would be our example of aluminum foil with Alcoa Aluminum Company of America. And so this is an old example, but it's a good one just nonetheless. So at this point in time that we're talking about, Alcoa controlled 80% of the aluminum foil market. And so they were being charged with antitrust violation, and they were threatened to be broken up. And Alcoa came back and said, yes, we do have 80% of the aluminum foil market. However, we only have 30% of the overall food wrap market. Overall food wrap would include what? Saran wrap, wax paper, Ziploc bags, Tupperware, the list goes on. So it's a significantly smaller portion. This is where that substitution effect comes into play. So really what Alcoa is saying is that if you increase the price of aluminum foil, the competition is going to kick in, and the substitution effect is going to kick in even more so. And that is that people would move away from aluminum foil and use other wraps rather than aluminum foil. So that's cross-price elasticity, all kinds of other types of, the other piece we're talking about, complementary goods. So substitution effect, price of good A increases, law of demand dictates the quantity demanded of good B, good A decreases, and as a result of which, ceteris paribus, the price of good B remains the same, the demand for good B increases. So the price of good A goes up, the quantity demanded of good B increases. So they're kind of moving in the same direction. Substitution effect. as opposed to complementary goods. Example, that would be like peanut butter and jelly. So we're saying the price of peanut butter goes up, then it's going to cause what? A decrease in the quantity demanded of good B. In this case, we're talking about jelly. So peanut butter goes up, hot dog buns, price of hot dogs go up, the quantity demanded of hot dog buns is reduced. They go together, right? Anyway, that's a complementary. Those are complementary goods. All the different types of elasticity, income elasticity, of course, the more income that you have, etc. Tax elasticity is, raising taxes on cigarettes, and you're going to go past that midpoint, and by increasing taxes beyond that point, you're going to experience what? A loss in tax revenue, etc. Anyway, that kind of wraps it up, if you will, for elasticity. Okay, so onward we go in talking about. We're moving into the area of cost curves now. So this is chapter 9, of course, wholeheartedly, but also I believe is also part of chapter 6. But nonetheless, this will wrap it up for the course. The big portion, so kind of bear with me here. So on cost curves and the production function. Diminishing returns. Diminishing returns are very, very straightforward. Our example that we used in class would be something on the order of you've got 4 hours to study. You've got 4 chapters to study for, and you get through the first 3 chapters of studying, and it takes you 2 hours. So you're flying along, and because your brain is sore. And you're tired of looking at screens, or you're tired of doing stuff, your productivity starts to drop, and so this last chapter takes you the other half. So it takes you 2 hours to complete the last chapter. That's diminishing returns. You're putting more effort or the same effort in, and you're getting a smaller result or a less of a result. So the various inputs. So this is the short run. And when we say the short run, increased production puts pressure on our limited resources. This is, again, very, very straightforward. Our limited resources, that supply curve, remember, moving upward to the right. The 2 reasons it moves upward to the right. One is the profit motive. Secondly is because of to produce more of something, you're going to be producing less of something else. It becomes more costly. Think in terms of the production possibility curve or frontier. So when we talk about costs, when we're looking at cost curves, let's start with variable cost, variable inputs. Variable cost would include such things as like labor, raw materials. If we're talking about actually producing something, the raw materials that go into that, and back to, again, wrapping our head around these elasticity, sensitivity to prices. If we're going to be using more labor, more raw materials, the prices, of course, are going to rise with that. That upward sloping supply curve reflects, again, what we just described before, those increased costs as well as that profit motive. So moving from the short run to the long run, in the long run, we're forced to deal with diminishing returns from the short run. So we're forced to try to deal, when we say deal with those diminishing returns, is we're trying to make a decision as to whether or not we want to continue on the same path, or if, in order to continue along the same path, it's going to take more effort and so on and so forth. So we're expanding the production to the point where you have to ultimately change those fixed cost structures, meaning that you're producing 500 meals a day in a restaurant, and that's the maximum you can do. You're well into the diminishing returns area. Your costs have gone up significantly, but there's a demand for your product. People are waiting in line. So what do? That's when you make a decision to, 1, open up another store, 2, expand the current facility, 3, bring in new equipment. All these things that kind of come into play that are what? These are fixed costs. These are costs that are going to change your cost structure entirely. So speaking of costs, we talked before about variable cost, and so on the right we've got a picture of our total variable cost, and we typically just call it variable cost, meaning that if you're producing more of something, you're going to incur more variable cost. If you're producing more cars, that means that it's going to cost more labor. It's going to cost more in terms of the steel that goes into the vehicle and so on and so forth. Those are all variable costs, and we say in this case we're using car analogy, old one anyway, meaning this was from many years ago. But the idea, of course, is that there's 10,000 we're looking at its cost. The variable cost is $10,000 per unit. And what that means is that for every unit that's produced, you incur that cost of what? $10,000. So you're producing, the more units that you produce, the more variable cost. That's why it slopes upward to the right. Average variable cost is that if you just take the total number of units, the dollars by the number of units, you get that $10,000 per unit. So that's why it's the average variable cost is flat in this case. It's just representative of that. We'll talk more about that going forward. So that's variable cost, total variable cost and average variable cost. Total variable cost sloping upward to the right, average variable cost being a flat line going across. So strictly speaking, there are two types of costs, but actually there are probably three types of costs. And what those costs are in our variable cost, in this case we're showing fixed costs, and there might be something called mixed costs that are in part, they seem to be fixed costs, but they change over time. They can change over time. Anyway, we won't go there. So we're just going to say variable cost and fixed cost, right? So on the left, we show our fixed cost. This is our total fixed cost. Fixed costs don't change, right? In this case, we are investing $2 billion in fixed costs to produce a new vehicle. And so that has not changed. Whereas on the right, we're looking at that average fixed cost, and that's the overhead. We're spreading that over the number of vehicles that are being produced. So the first vehicle off the line, say that we're producing, theoretically that incurs all the fixed costs that's out there. So that one vehicle that cost, the variable cost was $10,000 and the fixed cost was $2 billion. So it's $2 billion, $10,000 is that first vehicle. And so you're putting the variable cost and the fixed cost together. So the more vehicles that you produce, well, of course, you're spreading it out over more vehicles until you get to this 1 millionth vehicle, and that's breaks down to about $2,000 per vehicle at that 1 million mark. And the expression that we use is called asymptotic as we're approaching zero. So keep that in mind. So average fixed cost, we're spreading it out over vehicles and it approaches zero. The more production we have, the closer it gets to that zero, that asymptotic zero. That's the expression. So again, we're on to chapter 9, but anyway, short run versus long run. The short run, we have to cover our variable cost. So long as we cover our variable cost, we continue producing. The question, of course, is why is this? It seems kind of counterintuitive, but think about it. You have a restaurant and you've got lease expense of $1,000 a month, and you're stuck in that restaurant with this lease agreement over 5 years. So that means that for the next 5 years, you have to pay $5,000 a month. You can't get out of it. That's a fixed cost. You can't break your lease. We're making the assumption, but the point again being is that you've incurred this cost and you can't change it. It's a sunk cost. You cannot change it. You cannot alter it in any way. It's there and you can't get rid of it. All the machinery and equipment that you have, the fryers, the grills, and so on and so forth. These are all fixed costs. Washers, dishwashers, etc. These are all fixed costs that they're not easily set aside. You can sell them, but anyways, that's neither here nor there. Point is that they're there, and it's a sunk cost. You can't get it's irretrievable. So this is why when we say that in the short run, so long as you cover your variable cost plus $1, we'll say marginal. So you cover your variable cost plus $1, then you keep operating. Meaning that you keep, so long as you can pay for your employees, cover your payroll, cover the cost of your raw materials that you're producing with, so long as you can cover those costs, you keep operating. The reason is, again, your fixed cost is just that. It's fixed. It's sunk cost. You can't change it. And you're hoping that over a period of time, over the next 5 years, your variable cost, you will be able to cover your variable cost. Meaning you'll be able to cover your fixed cost and your variable cost because that is the decisioning point. So the long run, again, is just that. It's the decision to adjust your fixed cost to expand production or to shut down. If you reach the end of that 5-year period and you're still not covering your variable cost, then by all means you should shut your operation down. That's going to be a window of opportunity. And a lot of people don't follow that. They continue on. After that, it's and re-up, and they end up with the same problems that they had before. Anyway, it's important that since that average fixed cost is asymptotic in the long run, then, because then when we say asymptotic, it approaches zero. In the long run, all costs, virtually speaking, become variable. So remember we were talking about that before, the previous piece when we were looking at the $2 billion and you that fixed cost, then it breaks down at the after 1 million units, it's down to $2,000 worth of fixed cost, and so it's virtually disappeared. It's virtually gone, right? So this is when production beyond that is just covering your variable cost is really what it is, and that's the idea, is that the fixed cost disappears, right? And again, I already said this before, but I'll repeat it. It's important since the average fixed cost is asymptotic. In the long run, all costs become variable. And that's our representation here, where that average variable cost is on the bottom, and the next line up is our fixed cost. So our fixed cost approaches that average variable cost. Our average total cost is the whole average variable cost plus the average fixed cost. That average fixed cost is disappearing entirely, and it becomes what? All variable cost. All right. So in this next grouping, what we're looking at is a production function. And we've already kind of introduced cost, variable cost, fixed cost, et cetera. So we're going to step away from fixed costs. We're just looking at the variable cost. And our representation on the production side is the reverse image of what variable costs look like. And this is what's called the production function. And this is, we're setting aside dollars. We're taking the dollars out. That's what costs are. Costs are monetizing this production. And this production, in the y-axis, we got the total level of production, and on the x-axis, we're looking at labor. So we're disregarding fixed cost for the moment, and we're just focusing on labor. It could be any of the productive resources or any combination thereof, but we're just looking at labor in this case. So when we talk about diminishing returns in terms of the production function, we have different types of diminishing returns. Average should start with marginal, but we'll just say average returns, total output divided by total input. Marginal returns, the change in total output divided by the change in the total input. So again, when we're talking about marginal, it means one more unit. So our representation here, our picture of this production function, this hump-shaped curve, this upside down U in essence, right? That's the variable cost flipped upside down into this hump-shaped production function. So we're focusing on our inflection points when things start to change directions. So if we're looking at diminishing marginal returns, what happens is that it's at the steepest point of this production function, sloping upward, and after this point, it's starting to bend downward. It's not going down negatively, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate is really what we're saying. So what that also means is that if you look at the bottom portion below the production function, that's a total physical product on top, and underneath you'll see the breakout with marginal physical product and average physical product. So that first point of inflection when we reach diminishing marginal returns, that's the high point so far as marginal physical product is concerned. Moving rightward, still upward, is that marginal physical product is beginning to drop, until, of course, it's continuing on to the point where our average, we reach the point of diminishing returns for our average returns. So diminishing average returns is our second point of inflection. So we're decreasing at an even more rapid rate when we get to that average physical product. That's the second inflection point. So that's the top of the average physical product, and it's also the point where marginal physical product crosses that average physical product. Think about it in terms of baseball average. So your overall average, you're batting 300, which is pretty good. So every 10 times at bat, you get 3 hits, which is it's worth several $1 million a year for a professional baseball player if you're a full-timer. Anyway, even if you're a part-timer, I suppose in some cases. So your average is 300, and you go into a series, into a weekend series, and you bat. You average 4 for 10 over that series. So you're batting 400. That's going to increase your average by by a certain portion. So that's when the marginal physical product is increasing. Your average physical product is also doing what? Increasing. So long as your marginal physical product is above your average physical product, that average physical product will be increasing. Even though it's gone past that point when we're looking at diminishing returns of that, the marginal physical product, your marginal returns are are diminishing at that point, moving rightward. They're still above that average physical product. Once they drop below that average physical product, both average physical product and marginal physical products are reducing. So you're batting below 300. You're batting 300 average, and the next series you bat 250. It's going to do what? It's going to reduce your overall average. So that's the point, is that we're talking about, is that where diminishing returns moves from marginal returns to average returns, diminishing returns, to total diminishing returns. Total diminishing returns occur when the marginal physical product actually reaches zero. You're actually crossing that x-axis. It's not to say it won't continue on after that, it certainly does. But that is at the top of the total physical product curve. And then moving rightward from that, of course, we reach the point where when average physical product goes to zero, when total physical product goes to zero, your average physical product will also be at zero. So an example of this. Anyway, cost curves are U-shaped product curves. First, we have increasing productivity, then we have falling costs. Second, we have decreasing productivity and rising cost. So this is the flip side of that. Product curves are inverted cost curves. Product divided by labor, marginal physical product, average physical product, total physical product. First, there are increased productivity, and then there are declines, and that moves into diminishing returns when they start to decline in each of those categories: marginal physical product, average physical product, and total physical product. So real world example is something I mentioned in class already, but I'll bring it up again. China 50 years ago was, maybe even 60 years ago, was well over 50% agricultural, meaning that most of the people in China were living on farms. And so what China saw was that you had, say, a farm of, you had a 50-acre farm with 100 people living on that farm, working that farm, all done manually. And you're well past the point of diminishing total returns even. You're way past that. Especially when you consider like an American farm, probably a 100-acre similar farm might be 1 or 2 people that are working on that farm full time. So that's much more productive, obviously, than 100 people working on a 50-acre farm, right? So the point is that China said, okay, we are well into the area of diminishing returns, so we've got to fix this problem. So what do? You start pulling people off the farm. So what do? They moved millions, tens, if not hundreds of millions of people into cities, which is again why you've got cities in China that are 10, 20, 30, 50 million people. It's just unreal, the scale of the size of those cities in China. But anyway, their rationale was, and it was pretty accurate. It was brutal what they did, but it was accurate in terms of making the farms more productive by pulling those additional resources, in this case the labor, off the farm. Okay. Anyway, that's a quick example. This is again the production function, which leads again to this to the variable cost curves. Okay, so here's another quickie presentation. We're looking at average physical product and marginal physical product, and here we're looking at the output of hamburgers, the input of labor. So where average physical product is at maximum, marginal physical product is equal to it. So when that average physical product is at the top, that is where marginal physical product is dropping down through it. So if marginal physical product is greater than average physical product is rising. So if you're batting 300 and that's your average is 300 and you will go 4 for 10, you're going to be what? Marginally, you're increasing. You're driving your average your total overall average up. So your average physical product would be rising. Marginal physical product is equal to average physical product. That average physical product is at its maximum. So we're talking about continuity, moving in the same direction, moving. It's not like it's going to bounce back up. Marginal physical product is on its way down because we're increasing, the inputs, and it's becoming less efficient. So once we're past that point, when marginal physical product is less than average physical product itself is falling. So if your batting average is 300 and your next time next series you bat 250 or 25%, then it's going to reduce your batting average overall, right? So again, I said this before, we started out with cost curves and we jumped into the production function, and now we're going back into more deeply again into these cost curves. So cost curves again are the mirror image of those product curves. So U-shaped product curves. Product curves are hump-shaped, and cost curves are U-shaped product curves. So marginal cost. So we've got the three components: marginal cost, average cost, and total cost. Oftentimes we don't even we don't even say total cost, we just say cost. But at any rate, we'll kind of walk through this. So the cost of inputs divided by the physical product at each level of production, we're monetizing it. We're putting this into dollars. As on the left-hand side, rather than looking at production level, we're looking at dollars. So we're saying dollars on the y-axis and units, the amount that's actually being produced on the x-axis. The same idea with cost again. The cost of inputs divided by the physical product at each level of production. The same idea with cost, inverted. Lower levels of production, we start lower levels of production, we have increasing returns, and eventually we encounter diminishing returns. So the cost curves, of course, increased returns means that we're actually sloping down. We're reducing our cost, and when we bottom out, so to speak, and continue on to the right, the costs are beginning to rise. So that's diminishing returns territory, right? Where average cost, variable cost at a minimum, marginal cost is equal to it. It goes up through it, just as it does the flip side when we're talking about the production. The marginal physical product and the average physical product. So marginal cost is less than average variable cost. Average variable cost is rising. Marginal cost is equal to average variable cost. Average variable cost is at a minimum. It's at the bottom. When marginal costs are greater than average variable cost, then average variable costs are rising, as well as the marginal costs are continuing to rise as well. You got it? Okay, so moving again in this concept of moving from the short run to the long run. The short run average cost curves and long run average cost curves on the right, we can see the depiction of that, and let's walk through this. So again, this represents a firm with an ability to change plant size to adjust its fixed cost. And remember, moving from the short run to the long run means what? We're adding fixed cost, or we're changing our fixed cost structure, if you will. So the reality is, moving from one short run to the next short run, to the next short run, to the next short run, these are all depictions of that long run average cost curve. But what you'll notice here is that the reason that we continue to stay in business, for one, and the reason that we continue to alter our fixed cost is not just that it wears out, that could be part of it too, but it's also because we're all about what? Reducing our overall cost, our long run average cost. And until we reach that point at the very bottom of this long run average cost curve, where we're moving to the right of that point, we end up with what? Increased cost. So these are diminishing returns. And just as it is with price elasticity of demand, how do we know when we reach that the bottom of this long run average cost curve? The only way we know it is by going beyond it. Marginal analysis. Remember, taking one step beyond that in order to find out when things start to come back up again. When we start running into diminishing returns, when your costs begin to rise. So we're moving, in this case, from economies of scale on the left of the, when your long run average cost curve is falling, to the right, where your long-run average cost curve is rising, that's diseconomies of scale. And this is oligopoly territory, quite frankly. When you're adding more and you're building, you're growing your firm, you're getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And this is, again, using an auto company, for example. All these different short-run cost curves might be different facilities that you're building, assembly plants, different types of production facilities, adding more production facilities to the mix. And this also, as I'm kind of jumping at here, think oligopoly, you have to be big to compete. The cost of capital, all that fixed capital has to be absorbed. Remember, the biggest barrier to entry to an oligopoly or to monopoly is the dollars that are involved. Not just the dollars, of course, there's time, and which is also money as well. But there's a huge, huge cost. And the cost that you incur at these oligopolies, much of those costs, at least at the very beginning, of course, are fixed costs. And so you've got to be big enough in order to absorb all that fixed cost. You've got to be producing enough units to absorb all that fixed cost. So there's something else called the minimum efficient scale, and that's, of course, is at the very bottom of this long-run average cost curve. And our example is the Ford Rouge complex of going too far. That's the example, moving into this diseconomies of scale piece, if you will. So the Ford Rouge complex was huge. It was it's in Dearborn, Michigan. It's a very large facility, and the idea was that Henry Ford, the senior Henry Ford, the guy who started the company, right? He did not like having to depend upon suppliers for different parts, different components going into vehicles, and his thought was the more that he could control, the better off he would be, the more he could ensure that there would be quality controls. And it makes sense. I mean, it sounds completely rational. But the problem was that he passed this minimum efficient scale quite a ways. He didn't even realize it. They didn't even realize it. Ford didn't realize it until they actually got their cost structures together, which would have been probably 10 years after they actually started the Ford Rouge complex. It really got up and running. They started to get a handle on their costs. It took quite a while. But anyway, they'd gone well past it from the economies of scale side, moving into the diseconomies of scale. And so the way you rectify that, of course, is by what? Making yourself smaller. So they ended up selling off portions of the Ford Rouge complex because they were making their own glass, they were making their own steel. So they were selling off a lot of that manufacturing part of the company. Anyway, so if you don't invest in, here's the takeaway. The other side of this problem is that if you don't invest in fixed cost enough, if you don't invest enough in fixed cost in particular, then your average costs are going to be too high and it's not sustainable. Example of this is Studebaker. Studebaker was a major automobile manufacturer, I don't know if they made trucks or not, I guess they probably did. But anyways, a vehicle manufacturer in South Bend, Indiana. And they were in operation basically, we'll just say from 1910 through about 1960. And for Studebaker, that was their short run, because what happened was that they reached the point where their costs were starting to rise. Variable costs were rising because they were not investing enough in fixed cost. They weren't building enough factories. They weren't adding enough machinery and equipment. They weren't modernizing. And they reached the point where they said, okay, if we do, in order to compete, we're going to have to invest a certain amount, not just in money, also in time and material, all the other things, but money is really what it comes down to. And they made a decision, a conscious decision. They said, nope, we're not going to go any further. We're shutting down, because they, of course, had reached the point where they were not able to do what? Cover all of their cost, right? Anyway, that's an example. So again, when we were talking before about that, the long run cost, and we're looking in this case at increasing returns, and we reached the bottom of that. Of our cost curve, if you will, and then after that are diminishing returns. Just another case, another situation, looking at it that way. So costs are on the rise. That's diminishing returns area. So the next thing we're looking at is productivity. Productivity, it's something that it's kind of hard to get our head wrapped around. We understand what it is. We've already kind of talked about diminishing returns and all the things that go along with it. We're we're studying and we're more productive for the first 2 hours where we get through 3 chapters, and the last hour it takes us 2 hours to get through 1 chapter. We're diminishing returns, we're reducing our productivity. Increasing returns, that's increased productivity, of course. So here's an example of how we measure productivity. It's very straightforward, very simple, but it's something that's used. It's in practice by the Bureau of Labor Statistics when they talk about labor productivity, for example. So in this case, we're looking at lug nuts and the connection between those lug nuts and productivity. Lug nuts, of course, are those nuts that go on your wheel hub to attach your wheel to the vehicle, to the wheel hub. And anyway, so we're producing lug nuts in this factory, and our hourly compensation of labor, our hourly rate is $20 per hour. The physical productivity of that labor is 100 lug nuts per hour, so we simply take 20 divided by 100, and that gets us our unit labor cost. How much each of those lug nuts being produced, how much labor goes into the production of those lug nuts. Each of those lug nuts, 20 cents. So if we have an increase in productivity, so increasing returns, right? Same hourly compensation of $20 per hour, but we actually increase our physical productivity, the amount that we're actually producing, from 100 to, with a 10% increase, 100 to 110, which reduces our unit labor cost by 2 cents, going from 20 cents down to 18 cents per unit. The last column, we're saying that there's an increase in the price of our labor, going from a 10% increase in the price of our labor, going from $20 up to $22, and the physical product, the original physical product, didn't change from 100. So that, of course, drives up our unit labor cost by 2 cents up to 22 cents per unit that's actually produced. So when we talk about this productivity gains, here's a question again. How do productivity gains get passed through to the consumer? Pretty straightforward question. And really what we're saying is that initially, of course, is that if you are a producer and you increase your productivity, you increase your efficiency in your production facility, are you going to pass those cost savings, if you will, onto your consumer in the form of lower prices? No way. You're going to spread it back, share the wealth back with your productive resource mix, making sure that you're covered too as the entrepreneur, right? So how does it ultimately get to the consumer? And that's through our invisible hand of competition. Someone sees that your business is doing very well, and they want to find out what it is, and basically it's designing the better mousetrap. You copy. That's what do they say about copying, it's a greatest form of anyway. The idea is that you're copying that process because it works, really, is what it comes down to. So you copy that process, and this goes through a few different iterations until you finally reach the point where someone says, hey, you know what I can do? If I reduce my prices going to the consumer, I will be able to increase my market share. Because remember, it's all about revenue. And assuming we are in the elastic range, again, if we reduce prices, we're going to be increasing our market share, and as a result of which, it's going to be more profitable for us. So we do that, and this is that invisible hand coursing, making its way through this market segment, if you will, in producing lug nuts. And so ultimately, what we're saying is that that productivity gain is ultimately going to be reaching the consumer through this competition, through this invisible hand of competition. Okay, so in this last example, we're going to walk through this. Take a little bit of time, won't take much. But our objective here is to reach that break-even point. We're trying to get to the point where we're trying to absorb all of that fixed cost. All the fixed costs, we've got $2 billion in fixed cost, and we're saying that each vehicle the variable cost for each vehicle is $10,000, and so our objective now again is to cover all of our costs, and we'll make this clear as we kind of go through. So Break even is equal on the right-hand side, fixed cost plus a variable cost, something priced at $12,000. We'll get to that, driving to a zero profit. So what we'll say, and just let's back up and we can walk through that on the right at the very end. So we've got $2 billion worth of fixed cost to absorb, and our variable cost amounts to $10,000 per vehicle. So let's just say we produce 1 million vehicles. We're producing 1 million vehicles, and our variable cost $10,000 per vehicle. That's if I get this right, $10 billion, correct? So that's $10 billion of variable cost. And we also have what? $2 billion worth of fixed cost. So that gets us, and if we're saying our break-even point is that our break-even dollar, per vehicle point, that is, we're adding our variable cost and our fixed cost, so we need to produce 1 million units, and that would incur $10 billion worth of variable cost and $2 billion worth of fixed cost, and that gets us to our break-even of $12,000 per unit. And when we say break-even, that's zero profit, right? So think about it this way. So if we produce beyond 1 million, let's say we produce another 100,000 units, that would result in an additional profit, because remember, all the fixed cost has been absorbed. It results in an additional profit of $1 million. So this is the takeaway from this is, and you can look through this a few times, but the idea is that our break even again is at 1 million units. Not a big deal there. But the takeaway from this is that you have to produce a lot of units. You've got to produce a lot of vehicles in order to do what? To cover your fixed cost, to absorb all of your fixed cost. After that point in time, assuming you don't have to spend more in fixed cost, or at least minimize a minimal amount, what we're saying after that time, continued production. So moving from the 1 millionth unit, where we absorbed all of our fixed cost, to that next 100,000 units, we end up getting what? All that profit that would be associated with that fixed cost. And so we end up with an additional $1 million worth of profit as a result. All right? Anyway, so absorb all the fixed costs, then your profitability really takes off. This is kind of the takeaway. So you've got variable cost, fixed cost. The variable cost is going to continue. The fixed cost is going to be absorbed until it turns into what? Zero, virtually speaking. Anyway, that's it.